Good afternoon. Welcome to the seminar. Paula Bradley, who's a member of the Assembly's Social Development Committee, is here, and she's going to provide some opening comments before we hear the presentation from Lynn. Lynn's from the School of Sociology, Social Policy and Social Work at Queen's, and she's going to present the findings of her local neighbourhood case study, which examined whether conflict exists between young and old at a neighbourhood level and aimed to illuminate the wider social mechanisms that influence those relationships. So Lynn hopes that her research is going to help inform public policy intended to address the social challenges of an ageing population and the demographic challenges that we all face. Ray's researchers work in a number of subject specialisms. Mine happens to be public finance, which I suppose there's quite a lot of talk about the impact of demographic change on the exchequer. I mean, that we quite often hear about that in terms of pension liabilities and so on. We hear less about how younger and older people feel about the intergenerational equity of the way public facilities are funded, for example. And I wonder how aware younger people are about the way, for example, PFI, infrastructure development initiatives fund developments, and how aware younger people are that essentially that their future is being mortgaged to an extent to meet the needs of today. So perhaps we'll hear a little bit about that might touch on those areas. I always wonder whether there's a sense of injustice there. The presentation is going to take about half an hour. Then there's half an hour for discussion, when you guys are encouraged to participate with questions, share your views on the presentation and so on. There's tea and coffee at the back afterwards, which will give us an opportunity to have a chat informally. Then at 3 o'clock there is a tour available for those of you who are new to the building, or if anyone's interested in the tour of the building, that can be arranged. Can I ask everyone to turn mobile phones off? The seminar presentation is going to be video recorded. The discussion afterwards won't be, but we need the phones off for that anyway. So that's enough from me. I will ask Paula to come up now and make some opening remarks. Okay.
Well, good afternoon, and can I offer you all a very warm welcome to Stormont on this wonderful day. Can I also apologise on behalf of the Chair of the Social Development Committee. He's unable to make it today. It's actually their Ardèche is on this weekend, so they're all away. So I'm afraid you're stuck with me. I'm a member of the DUP for North Belfast, which is probably one of the highest areas of social deprivation within Northern Ireland. I'm quite new on the committee. I only joined it probably about 7-8 weeks ago, but my background is I was a member of the social work team of Antrim Area Hospital for quite a number of years and worked for CIB and various other voluntary and community groups before that. So I have a fair understanding of the impact of the coming welfare reform issues might have on our community. So I'll just take this opportunity to welcome you and to today's seminar on the life course, age and intergenerational relations. The seminar is of particular interest to the committee given the impact of changing demographics on Northern Ireland society will have wide-ranging policy implications for the Department of Social Development. Within the remit of the social development portfolio is the cradle to the grave social security system, which spans across all age cohorts, but which also facilitates intergenerational relationships. Younger people caring for older people caring for younger people, particularly with the increasing number of grandparents looking after grandchildren due to the inadequacy of the childcare infrastructure in Northern Ireland. Within the coming years, it will be particularly interesting to see how major policy issues such as welfare reform will both negatively and positively, and we don't often hear about positively, but how these will affect relationships between different age groups. There's a tendency for political debate to focus, as I said, on negative aspects of ageing, increased expenditure on pensions, healthcare and social security systems. Perhaps Lynn's research will reveal the positive, supportive side of intergenerational relationships, or at least help policymakers create the conditions in which intergenerational relationships can thrive. The Department of Social Development has, through various programmes via neighbourhood renewal and urban regeneration, attempted to bridge the gap between the generations by rethinking urban landscapes and creating more sustainable and inclusive public spaces across both the age and community divide. However, there is still, bear with me, undoubtedly much more that can be done across the range of government departments. Given that this year is a European year for active ageing and solidarity between generations, Lynn's research could not come at a more apt time for policymakers. This leads me nicely on to introduce Lynn Johnston from Queen's School of Sociology, Social Policy and Social Work. We're delighted that Lynn can join us today to present the findings of her neighbourhood case study using 3 themes: social exclusion, age discrimination and the legacy of the conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lynn.
All right, well, I'm going to begin by thanking everybody for coming as well, and for those of you who made it today on a sunny Friday afternoon, thanks very much, and I hope you think it's worth your while by the time I finish. So I'm actually now in my 5th year of my PhD. I had 3 years of full-time Dell funding, and then for the last year I was part-time, and I'm into my 5th year of part-time, and I'm hoping to submit my thesis later on this year, all being well. So the title of my thesis as it stands at the minute is same as it ever was: Intergenerational Relationships, a Neighbourhood Case Study. So it's attempting to be a contemporary snapshot of what intergenerational relationships are like within a particular neighbourhood in Northern Ireland. So I want to tell you a wee bit about what I'm going to talk about. So the outline is that I'm going to talk a wee bit about setting the scene, a bit of background about how I approached the research, and then talk a little bit about what I did, what the research involved, then the findings, and then finally attempt to relate these to relevant policy discussions. Oh, missed one out, sorry. So first of all, as was touched on by both speakers there, the global ageing demographic. So whereby it used to be that if you think of the population as in a pyramid, that it used to be that this represented younger people and this represented smaller numbers of older people. The evidence is now that things are changing, so it's more like this at the minute, and potentially it could be more like that, so that there's going to be a lot more older people than middle-aged and younger people in the population. And whilst that is, the fact that we're living longer, healthier lives, particularly in developed nations, is a triumph of modern development and medical science, but very often, as you've referred to, it's discussed in very negative terms, that the challenges for society is economic doom, that the traditional intergenerational exchange that exists, where the working age population supports the older population, that these things will fall apart with the ageing demographic. And as well as those economic problems, it's theorised that there's social problems and that there will be pressure on intergenerational relationships at the social level. And in terms of the public discourses around that, the demonisation of children and young people and our view of them as being antisocial and out of control, and accompanied with our view of older people as frail and vulnerable and in need of protection, that these sort of stereotypical images create a feeling that there is a disconnect between younger and older people in society. And so on the basis of those recognitions, as you've mentioned, this year is the European Year for Active Ageing and Solidarity Between Generations. And I suppose that, it shows the amount of attention that this issue is getting, that the fact that there's a European year designated to it, and also the fact that it's promoting solidarity between generations is sort of set within a frame that there isn't solidarity between generations at the present time. So to move on then to the research and my approach to it, my background is as a community worker, community education tutor and a community development worker, and the research is very much driven by my own values, which would be rooted in issues, I'm very motivated by issues of social justice, discrimination, equality issues. So in that frame, it's referred to as a critical research. So It's an approach to research which is a more value-committed approach, and it's a commitment not just to understand social issues, but to attempt to do something to change it. And as Holstein and Winkler refer to it, like a passionate scholarship that can actually move people to action, which is essentially why I'm putting myself through this today, in the hope that, somewhere, somehow, what I'm saying will make a difference. So the main question that I was asking was, what's the state of intergenerational relationships in the neighbourhood at this time? And what social mechanisms, or what are the social drivers that impact on those relationships? And really, in my view, the stuff of sociology is connecting personal issues and social problems with wider political and historical issues. And so with that in mind, the research looks at a wide range of issues to attempt to understand better the actual dynamic of relationships within the neighbourhood. And that's what Mills calls the sociological imagination. So the actual place where I conducted the research was an estate that was known to me through some previous work that I'd done. It's a public built housing estate outside Belfast, and along with a lot of other estates that were built outside Belfast in the early 70s, moving families and people out from Belfast from poor quality housing out to better quality housing in the hinterland. So this estate has about 800 households, about 1,500 residents, and 2001 data shows that there's they're kind of average statistics really for Northern Ireland in terms of the age demographic. 23% under 16, 16% over 60. Slightly more younger people in the estate, probably due to the number of families that would be there. And as you can see, 92% Protestant. So in terms of the deprivation statistics, the estate is actually getting worse if you view deprivation statistics as a measure of that. So from 2005 to 2010, they moved several percentage points closer to being in the top or the bottom 10% most deprived neighbourhoods in Northern Ireland. And I wanted to say as well that residents relocated really from East Belfast and Shankill. That was mainly where residents would come from. So what I actually did then in the research was I used just a whole mixed methods bag really. I did a community survey, spoke to residents, small group discussions, I had community groups, individual young people, groups of young people. I spoke to the primary 7 children in the local primary school, and I also volunteered in the community office for one morning a week for a period of about 18 months. I got access initially to the community through the Community Association, and that access was granted in October 2009, and all of this data was gathered really from January 2010 through to about the middle of last year, with some bits that are still ongoing really. So in terms of the findings then, it's framed around 3 issues, as we've said. So the first one I've called Mind the Gap, which is perceptions about age. So it's perceptions that people in the community have of younger people, and the perceptions that people in the community have of older people. The second theme is called Place Apart, and it's about the isolation of the place and the social exclusion, I suppose, experienced by the people who live there, and how that relates to intergenerational relationships. And the third is the legacy of the conflict, which I'm referring to as paramilitary. And I apologise if that phrase or that word isn't one that that group would like to be referred to as, or if it's not politically correct, or if I should use some other sort of phrase. But that was the word that was paramilitary, or paramilitaries was the words that the participants used to describe this group. So that's why I'm using that word. So the first issue then to look at was the denial of ageing, and this idea that we never grow old and we never stop being young. So like in the community survey data, the most common response was no, you never. Whenever I asked like at what age do you stop being a young person and at what age do you start being an older person, the most common response was you don't. You never stop being young and you never become old. So people said that it was more to do with lifestyle, when your priorities change, or that also it was in other people's perceptions. I'm not old, I don't grow old, but other people might perceive me as being old. And like one young fella said to me, you know, whenever I asked him, when do you get old? You know, he said, when you stop going to the pub. So I figure if I keep going to the pub, then I'll be all right. But anyway, this sort of idea that it's other people's perceptions sort of was born through, because whenever I asked people to give me their perceptions of young people, they were very, very able to do that, despite the fact that youth that never ends, you know, we're still very able to do that. And there was really very negative perceptions about young people from all ages of participants, including young people themselves. And there was this view sort of within that frame that they're not all bad, which is suggesting that most of them are, but that they're not, you know, some of them aren't so bad, kind of thing. And the other things that I want to comment on is the notion that parenting is to blame. There was quite a lot of evidence about people talking about the rights of children and the fact that it's not socially acceptable for us to physically discipline children anymore. And there was some evidence of how parents struggled with that. And like one grandmother told me about when she looked at her daughter mothering her granddaughter, she said that she looked at them and said, "Who's the mummy?" Because she sort of felt that there's different power balances, you know, that childhood is changing and that things are different now, that the rights of the child has sort of changed that, so that there's this perception that children and childhood has changed and also parenting is changing, and that parenting isn't coping with it. So within that, a lot of sort of talk of kids needing to be a bit of discipline, you know, and never did me any harm, those sorts of discussions, really. So the next couple of slides just illustrate the what younger people, perceptions of young people. So this was, I don't know if you can read it, but I was with two 14-year-old boys and I asked them to tell me words that they associated with the word young. So they said lighting fires and fireworks because it was around Halloween time. They also said vandalising, exciting, drugs, alcohol, disrespectful, park and smoking. So not a whole load of positive really, you know, from within the ranks of youth itself. And then I thought this was interesting because it describes those two views, summarises very nicely a lot of the findings, which were that there's two sides to how we view young people, that they're nasty and they're nice. And that was a primary 7 group that came up with that post-it note, which I thought was nice. So then to move on to perceptions of older people. There was that view of older people as being in need of protection and being dependent. So that this resident told me that you know, older people are scared of younger people and they don't really come out very much, even, and sometimes they're scared to answer the door. You know, if he was knocking on their door, they'd be scared to answer the door. And what I wanted to stress was the difference between the view that people have of their family members, of older family members, and that they were much more positive usually than the views that people had of older people generally in the community. And the next couple of slides sort of illustrate that. So this is a P7 girl's drawn of an old person. So I just asked her to draw an old person. She said, "Can I draw my granny?" And I said, "Just an old person, whatever you think, you know." So she drew my granny. My granny looks very young, I think, but she maybe is very young. But anyway, my granny is sweet. She's always kind and nice and she has love in her heart. So it's lovely, positive messages about an older person within the family. The next slide tells a slightly different story, and this was a drawing of an old person by a 9-year-old boy. Now, this wasn't in a school setting, so that might have influenced the young person might have felt more free to express how they felt about older people without a teacher there to sort of say, you know, be nice about them. So the speech bubble says there how they talk to young people, and it says, "Shut up, you pig." He hasn't spelt you very well, but it says, "Shut up, you pig." And this older person is grumpy and they can't see. So really, on the flip side, a very much more negative view of older people. So I just really want to emphasise that the grumpy and kind sort of sides, and also the nasty and nice sides, so that there's two views really at the same time. So the second issue then is about the place. So the location of the estate, initially, like a lot of those estates at that time, they were built on vested farmland, which was outside, about 3/4 of a mile outside the town. The the original settlers did share a lot of hardships. You know, there was no community centre, there was no church, there was no primary school, there was no shops. They are all in place now, but for the first 5 or 6 years there was none of that. And people were moving down from Belfast, where families were living in very close proximity to this place where there was no tarmac and there was cows. Next to them, one woman told me about her mother-in-law was coming to visit on the Sunday, and she had her roses out, beautiful, and she woke up on the Sunday morning to check her garden, and the cow had trampled down the fence and ate the heads off her roses. So they were right, you know, in the middle of nowhere, really, you know. So it's a very tight community, and very much a feeling of belonging. People really feel that that's where they belong, and in that sense maybe that they don't belong anywhere else. But a sense of really staying put, so that a lot of families, not all the families in the estate, but some of the families in the estate would be occupying through nieces and nephews and grandchildren and brothers and sisters, maybe 10 households in the estate. So there would be a few families that would be where everybody stays put. And there was some evidence as well of people marrying from within the estate and staying in the estate. And also very negative prejudice from outsiders. You know, lots of evidence of that, of people knowing that they're judged negatively from outsiders. And as a result of that, quite a lot of mistrust of outsiders. And there was a very strong and defensive pride to counteract that, sort of saying, you know, they're wrong, it's not like that here. But alongside that mistrust, then, there's a preference to keep things internal, to find solutions internally to problems. And these are some quotes just to illustrate that. So in the early days, there was no road, it wasn't tarmac, it was like a building site. And this woman says it was the pits, didn't even think you got the same TV. And this sort of reflects the economic tightness. You know, it was very tight. If anyone wanted a haircut, they didn't go to the town, they went to the woman round the back of my mum, and her husband was the lemonade man. And this quote from a community worker who was at a meeting, and somebody asked him where did he work, and he said the name of the estate, and that was the response he got. So a lot of evidence of that very negative prejudice from outside. And some of the evidence here of how people reflect that then and deal with that. It's the best estate in town, and I wouldn't move out of here for love nor money. Okay, so the third issue then is the legacy of the conflict. And whenever I started researching intergenerational relationships, I didn't imagine that I would be talking about paramilitary activity. But really, whenever I spoke to people in the estate about, you know, what do you think of young people and what do you think of older people, they started talking about the paramilitary and about the impact of that on relationships between younger and older people. So I suppose I was quite naive, really, that paramilitary activity wouldn't be impacted on intergenerational relationships. It wouldn't matter what social issue you were researching in that estate, paramilitary activity would be influencing it. And there's a very interesting two-tiered accountability system. There's one man who's been a voluntary community worker in the estate for the last sort of 15 to 20 years. He did have previous associations with the paramilitary group and has none now whatsoever. And he provides an amazing service, amazing mediation service really, to try to, and his motivation would be to prevent paramilitary involvement in the discipline of children and young people. So, and a couple of examples of things that I've heard that he's done. Well, first of all, everybody in the estate mentioned him. Everybody knew him by name. Everybody knew where he lived and knew how to contact him. There was one story I was told where it was an older couple, and there was a group of young people, and they were calling the older man names related to his disability, and they were being very abusive really towards this older man. And so they called the community representative, and he went and found out who they were, because they told him what the kids were wearing. So he ran around the estate, found them, and the next night those young people arrived at the doorstep and gave a sincere and proper apology for their behaviour. But even himself, he recognises that you know, young people might not respond so positively to his requests for them to adjust their behaviour if it wasn't for the existence of a larger paramilitary threat in the estate. And the reason maybe why a lot of people do respond so positively to him is because there's an understanding that he's the first kind of tier, and if the behaviour continues, or is at a different level, then there may be a direct intervention, and that the paramilitary group wouldn't be so polite or reasonable as he would be. Okay, so just some of the evidence then around paramilitary activity. So teenage boy, and this was in 2010. Something happens every few months, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. You'd hear somebody being beaten up or having their kneecaps done. A more middle-aged man, he said his view was that kids do have that fear that if they do something, or if they're caught doing something, that they might be visited by the paramilitaries. And then an older woman also, she's sort of expressing the positive side of it, the protective side of it. She's saying, like, we live in a place where there isn't that threat to pensioners. It'll happen once, it won't happen again. And whenever I clarified later with her who the leaders in the estate were, she was referring to the paramilitaries. So she says the leaders in this estate won't let them get away with it, that's it. So, you know, whilst a lot of their activity would be, you know, viewed as very negative, there would be some tacit support, because you can, you know, like as somebody said to me, if your neighbour is playing music 24 hours a day, you could use your sleep between now and June, or between now and Christmas, let's say, you know, which would be the length of time it would take for the council and the housing executive maybe to, or the police to act on that loud music or whatever, whereas, you know, one visit from the paramilitaries could resolve it immediately, you know. So just to summarise then, the social influences on intergenerational relationships, that the perceptions of youth as being in need of discipline and older people as being in need of protection, that those then also then that there's an isolated and insular neighbourhood, that there's a preference for internal solutions. And then alongside that there is a local group willing to act as the disciplinarian. And I was told a story that I think sort of brings the three of those things together quite well, that there was a woman who was exasperated with the behaviours of her teenage son and didn't feel capable of disciplining him herself. And rather than look to outsiders for solutions, she looked internally for solutions, and she asked the paramilitary to discipline her child on her behalf, which they did. So the other, in terms of sort of a theoretical backdrop, I'm looking at ambivalence, and ambivalence really has its roots in psychology, which suggests that it describes the activity of holding at once two completely opposite views of the same issue. And really, I think there's quite a lot of social ambivalences within the study. So I've already drawn out the sort of grumpy kind views of older people and the kind of nasty nice views of younger people. But also the residents' pride and shame in the place, you know, appears to be very ambivalent. And then also the conflicting views about the actions of the paramilitary, a brutal service which is often useful, as I've highlighted. And then in that I also wanted to point out the conflict that exists from the statutory sector, because the reality is that on occasions it would be the police or the housing executive that might call at your door to say, we've received notification that you're in danger of being put out of the estate, so you need to move on. And you can see how that, you know, from the residents' perspective, you know, would just support that view of mistrust of the statutory sector. I'm not suggesting for a minute that any of those police officers or housing executive people are supporting the activity of the paramilitary, but how it's viewed from within the state is that that is a sanction of the activity, that whilst it's the paramilitary that have decided that you need to get out, it's the police and the housing executive that are telling you. So really with that in mind then, that the social ambivalence, I view them as sort of creating tense spaces where inequality and discriminatory activities and summary justice can take place. So then to look at policy implications. In terms of the perceptions about young and old, I think that there has to be policy to tackle ageism. that sort of exists at the foundation of these sort of views of children as of being in need of discipline and older people in need of protection. And it's relevant this year, of course, because later on this year there'll be the consultation for the extension of the age discrimination legislation to cover goods and services. And really I would say that that must cover all ages. It must be about age discrimination against all age groups, not just older people. I think intergenerational contact at a local level is very important, because there is evidence, and there was some intergenerational projects within the estate, and there was evidence that did break down those stereotype images that older people had of younger people and younger people had of old. And I have to declare an interest here because in January of this year I started working for Lincoln Generations Northern Ireland, who promote intergenerational practice in local community projects. And also I think it's important for policy to recognise that it's, well, I know nobody thinks policy is straightforward, but to recognise that it's not just a case of conflict and solidarity, but that both coexist, and it's somewhere within that is the opportunity for policy to intervene. In terms of the second issue then, the social exclusion, I think that opening dialogue by just building personal relationships between statutory workers and community representatives is crucially important, and that process has begun over the last few years in the neighbourhood. And there's starting to be spaces where people can have more honest conversations about what's happening. But in terms of that, there needs to be continuous service for PSNI officers, for example, and a more community development approach to health services as they're delivered. And really, just to say that I think policymakers must genuinely seek and genuinely take heed of the consultations and the guidance from local people as to what the key social issues are, mainly because it's a very highly contextualised situation, as you can tell, that I'm talking about. And so a blanket policy just doesn't work for that. It has to be a highly contextualised response. And thirdly then, the legacy of the conflict. Now, I'm not going to suggest that I have the policy recommendations to resolve the legacy of the conflict, but what I would say is that no social policy could tackle issues of social exclusion or issues of intergenerational relationships without tackling the ongoing paramilitary neighbourhood control. And one of the suggestions maybe would be, because young men in particular are most likely to be the victims in terms of paramilitary activity, it would be boys really from the age of 14 or 15 through to mid-20s were almost exclusively the people who had been targeted from the stories that I'd heard, and I'd have to say allegedly, of course. So I think services for young men in particular, and of course the Don Purvis report recently looking at the educational achievement of young men in Protestant communities would back that up, that there needs to be specific services, but I think most importantly they have to be long term. From my background in community development, you're lucky you might get a project that runs for 6 weeks, you might get a project that runs for a year. All your money has to be spent by the 31st of March. You might get a 3-year project, and if you're very lucky you might get a 5-year. But these responses have to be long term, and they have to be, people have to be able to rely on them in the long term. And so just then as well, in terms of policy, I think mechanisms which enable outsiders and residents to have some sort of safe space where they can talk and share information about the reality of what's happening in the estate, that might help to just open the conversations. So I'll just go back to finish off then, that my original question was, what is the state of intergenerational relationships at this time, and what social mechanisms impact on the relationships? And so I'm suggesting that at the personal level, which was where I thought really most of my research would be, but I think it is a very fundamental point that these ageist perceptions that we have of younger people and older people do create a kind of a healthy growing medium for, just perpetuating, I suppose, negative stereotypes. And then at the social level within the neighbourhood, the social exclusion and the desire that people have for internal preferences to resolve problems also influences on how intergenerational conflicts are dealt with. And thirdly then, at the structural level, the legacy of the conflict in that there is a group existing that's willing to provide that internalised service to deal with these badly disciplined children and to protect these vulnerable older people. And alongside that, in terms of structural, I would also add that there is a lack of clear messages really from statutory bodies as to what is acceptable. And that would be the view from estate residents, that the message isn't clear. So I just want to finish off with that quote, which is when I asked this 14-year-old boy, you know, how do you feel about the paramilitary activity in the estate? And he said, when you grow up with it, you just get used to it. And I think, you know, that's probably why I want to make a difference, that we have a duty that in 20 years' time there won't be another 14-year-old boy growing up in this estate saying, when you grow up with it, you just get used to it. So there's some references, and I'll finish on that quote. All right, thank you.